A billionaire takes her son to dinner, then sees a single mom, and what he saw left him in tears. The five-star Riverstone Prime restaurant shimmered with light, its golden crystal chandeliers casting dazzling reflections across gleaming glass surfaces and ornate vintage gold trim. That same warm glow danced across the polished silver cufflinks and the elegant Swiss timepiece on the wrist of Jonathan Ellison, a billionaire CEO of 44 years. Known throughout the business world for his unshakable composure and iron discipline. He entered the restaurant with a calm yet commanding presence, one hand gently supporting the back of his 7-year-old adopted daughter, Sophie. The little girl clung to the hem of her father's expensive tailored suit, whispering as though afraid the world might hear, "Daddy, I don't like crowds. They scare me." Jonathan inclined his head slightly in acknowledgment, his eyes scanning the lavish interior as he steered them discreetly toward the private VIP dining area. But he came to an unexpected halt. His gaze had been caught by something entirely out of place in such an opulent setting. A woman in a faded light coat, her face etched with exhaustion, yet her eyes tender and attentive, was carefully cutting a piece of steak on her son's plate. The boy, around 8 years old, grinned broadly, his eyes sparkling with the joy of a sunrise. Sophie stood motionless, completely captivated by the humble but deeply heartwarming scene. Jonathan's brow furrowed faintly. "Sophie, don't stare," he murmured, but she would not look away from the modest table near the window. "I want to sit with them, Daddy," she whispered, her hand still clutching his coat. The woman's name was Rebecca Moreno, 37 years old, a single mother working 2 jobs to support her son Noah. During the day, she worked as a waitress, and at night she drove for Uber. Their life was modest, materially limited, but full of love and quiet, devotion. Rebecca always tried to set aside a little money at the end of each week to treat Noah to something special as a small reward for his efforts. Today was such an occasion. Noah had just brought home a perfect report card, brimming with praise from his teachers. Riverstone Prime was far beyond anything they could afford, but Rebecca had discovered a small restaurant tucked next door, offering good food at reasonable prices. A simple mistake by a young server had led them instead to a secluded corner table in the grand hall of the luxury restaurant. Rebecca had meant to correct the error, but then she had paused. Just once, she wanted her son to see the sparkling lights, to feel for a single evening what it was like to live in a fairy tale. Noah was a bright, curious and polite boy, never shy about striking up conversations, his gaze always wide with wonder and admiration. At that moment, he was looking up at the grand chandeliers, completely unaware that one of the most powerful men in the city had just entered and was now watching him from across the room. Jonathan Ellison, the man whose image regularly graced the covers of prestigious business magazines and who was famously guarded about his private life, was present that night as part of a carefully orchestrated media campaign to soften his public image. Tonight was meant to present him as a father, a man with a heart, not just a machine that made money. Every detail had been meticulously arranged. He would dine at a discreet table, under soft lighting, with photographers discreetly capturing the tender moment of a father having dinner with his daughter. But Sophie changed the script. "Daddy, I want to sit with that boy." He laughed so happily, and his mummy looked so kind. She tugged at his hand, her eyes pleading. Jonathan, a man who had built his entire life on logic and strategy, found himself caught off guard by the raw emotion in his daughter's voice. Sophie was normally quiet, introverted and reserved. Yet now, her eyes held a light he had never seen before. In that moment, he realized that through all the years, he had given his daughter everything money could buy, from private tutors to smart toys, but never had he been able to buy her the simple joy that now radiated from her face. A restaurant manager approached quietly, his tone hesitant. "Sir, that family may not be an appropriate fit for this area. We can arrange for them to be seated elsewhere." Jonathan looked from his daughter's pleading eyes to the manager's uneasy expression. The instincts that had made him a titan of industry surfaced, but this time they took the side of something far more human. His voice was calm and resolute. "Tonight, my daughter decides." Before anyone could react, he turned and walked directly toward the small table where Rebecca and Noah were seated. Rebecca looked up, startled, recognizing the familiar face from business publications now approaching her. The golden light caught on his tie, but what shone brightest to her was the rare kindness in his eyes, something unexpected in a place like this. Jonathan gave a slight nod. "My daughter would like to have dinner with you and your son. May we join you?" And so it was that two worlds, which seemed destined never to meet, quietly touched right there in the heart of Riverstone Prime. The story is only just beginning, and if you've felt a stirring deep within your heart, don't forget to subscribe to the Emotional Echoes channel, give this video a like, and share it with those you hold dear. Each time you share, you help build a bridge that brings these heartfelt stories closer to others who may need them. Where are you listening from? Leave us a comment below and let us know how far this story has traveled. We truly cherish hearing your thoughts, so that with each new video, we can connect with you in a more honest and meaningful way. And now, let us continue with part 2 of the story. Rebecca hadn't even had time to react before Noah let out a soft, delighted squeal, his eyes lighting up the moment he saw Sophie approach. The little girl sat down beside him without a moment's hesitation, as if they had been friends for years. "I love the lights here," Sophie said, her wide eyes gazing up at the ceiling. Noah responded with eager enthusiasm, pointing out the crystal chandeliers that reminded him of a cartoon he once watched. Jonathan took his seat across from Rebecca, offering a polite nod, though his eyes still held a trace of surprise. Rebecca, a little flustered but composed, returned the gesture, her voice gentle yet sincere. "I'm sorry if we've disrupted your evening." Jonathan interrupted her with a rare smile. "Not at all. In fact, I should thank you. Sophie has never opened up to anyone like this before." In that fleeting moment, Rebecca saw behind the polished, successful exterior a father who, like herself, was still feeling his way through the complexities of raising a child. Across the restaurant, Jonathan's media team was beginning to panic. The plan had been clear. A private dinner in soft lighting, a few carefully staged, candid shots to quietly circulate an image of a refined, devoted father. No one had anticipated that he would choose to sit with a simply dressed single mother at a small table not even marked on their floor plan. Eyes began to turn. Several familiar faces from the city's upper circles recognized Jonathan and whispered among themselves, as if witnessing a scene far removed from the expected script. Another restaurant manager approached the table, leaned in discreetly, and spoke with urgency. "Sir, we can relocate you to the private section as originally planned." Jonathan calmly placed his hand on the table, his voice measured but firm. "Tonight, my daughter makes the decisions." It wasn't loud, but it carried weight, enough that the manager silently withdrew. In his mind, the perfect evening he had crafted for the sake of public image was unraveling entirely. And yet, strangely, he didn't feel regret. He looked over at Sophie, giggling as Noah animatedly told her a story about a stray dog he had found near their building. Something inside Jonathan, something that had been sealed off behind boardrooms and deals and terms of acquisition, began to soften. Rebecca sat quietly across from him, saying little. But she sensed the shift in the air, between the curious glances from nearby tables and the rare kindness in the eyes of the city's most unapproachable man. She didn't know exactly what was happening, only that tonight Noah had smiled more than usual, and for her, that was enough. A server arrived with menus, pausing briefly when he noticed Rebecca's modest clothing. But before he could say a word, Jonathan gave a small nod and said gently, 2 small steaks, same as the kids, and 2 apple juices. Please put it all on my account. Rebecca opened her mouth to protest, but something in his expression, serious yet genuine, stopped her. I'm not offering out of pity, he said quietly. I'm offering out of gratitude. Tonight, because of you both, Sophie is different. Rebecca bit her lip, then gave a quiet nod. The 4 of them continued their meal together. The children chirped like sparrows, carefree and joyful, while the adults exchanged thoughtful glances from time to time, not quite words, but something just as meaningful. Jonathan found himself admitting what he had never allowed himself to say aloud. He knew how to build an empire, but he didn't know how to build a night that made his daughter laugh the way she was laughing now. Rebecca, in turn, remembered something she had long forgotten. That sometimes the simplest joys could come from the most unexpected places. A table in a fine dining restaurant, a man she never thought she'd meet, and eyes that looked past appearances into something quietly shared. The stares from around the room no longer made them uneasy, because in the midst of all that wealth, something priceless was unfolding. 2 children sharing a moment of innocent connection, and 2 adults beginning to understand the true weight of being present. Jonathan turned to his daughter, then looked back at Rebecca and spoke softly, more to himself than to her, as if anchoring a realization long overdue. Tonight, she taught me something it took me decades to learn. And just like that, all the carefully constructed narratives, the meticulously planned optics, the measured steps of image management dissolved. But in that unraveling, something else took root, something more honest, more alive. And for the first time, the man known for his cold ambition felt something close to salvation. Jonathan sat there, in a space more accustomed to million-dollar negotiations and whispered deals over wine older than most careers. But tonight, he was listening, truly listening to an 8-year-old boy excitedly tell a story about chasing a shaggy dog named Max across a dusty lot behind a row of worker apartments. His adopted daughter, Sophie, tilted her head with wide-eyed wonder, letting out a burst of laughter now and then, as if it were the best story she had ever heard. Rebecca sat quietly, her hand resting close to Noah's plate, occasionally reminding him to chew slowly, take a sip of water, her voice soft and her presence steady. She smiled, a little flustered each time Jonathan's eyes passed over her. She wasn't used to sitting across from a man in a custom-tailored suit, wearing a watch that likely cost more than the car she was still making monthly payments on. But what surprised Rebecca most wasn't his appearance. It was the way he listened to her son, with patience, without interruption, without condescension. Jonathan nodded with real interest when Noah talked about fixing a leaky faucet with a neighbor, and in that small moment, the boy's energy reminded him of something he hadn't felt in years. And Rebecca, who had assumed at first she had accidentally wandered into the carefully crafted public relations plan of a powerful man, began to see that Jonathan wasn't quite what the headlines made him out to be. He wasn't cold and intimidating like the magazine covers suggested, nor was he arrogant like the articles about his tech empire often painted him. He was just a father, trying to understand the world of a child, much like she had been doing for 8 years. For a moment, their eyes met. Not with the awkwardness of 2 people from different worlds, but with the quiet recognition of 2 souls who had fought their own battles, who were both weary in ways that didn't show, and who were both still trying stubbornly, quietly, to live with kindness in a world that rarely made it easy. Jonathan found himself thinking of his wife, the woman who had stood beside him in the early, uncertain years of building something from nothing. She had died from complications after surgery, leaving behind a silence he had never truly learned to fill. Sophie was the daughter of a close friend, a soldier who never came home from his final mission. Jonathan had adopted her while still grieving, stumbling into fatherhood with more fear than he ever admitted. For him, love had always felt complicated, unpredictable, and easy to lose. But tonight, watching the way Noah called Mum with such ease and affection, the way Rebecca smiled gently, then turned to wipe her son's mouth, Jonathan realized that maybe love wasn't always grand gestures or lifetime vows. Maybe it was in these small, steady things he had never known how to hold on to. Dinner arrived, rich with the scent of seared steak and creamy mashed potatoes, vegetables carefully arranged on gleaming white plates. Noah thanked the server before eating. Sophie glanced over and copied him. Jonathan chuckled quietly. He had never heard her do that before. Rebecca began cutting Noah's steak into bite-sized pieces, her hands quick and practiced. Jonathan found himself watching those hands, not delicate and manicured like the women he met at charity galas, but strong, slightly calloused, steady with the quiet competence that only hard work could teach. He saw patience in them, the kind that no school or seminar could ever provide. As Noah dug into his food with delight, Sophie leaned in close to her father and whispered just loud enough for him to hear, "I wish my mummy was like Miss Rebecca." Jonathan froze for a breath. He didn't know how to respond. When had his daughter, who had been given every educational toy, every private tutor, every meticulously scheduled afternoon, come to long for something so simple? A woman with no car of her own, no housekeeper, no degrees framed on the wall, just a worn coat and a gentle heart. He turned his gaze to Rebecca, still quietly helping her son, unaware that she was being seen in a way she had never been seen before. In the warm, golden light, her face bore the fatigue of a long day, but there was a peace there too, a stillness, something he couldn't quite name. When she looked up and caught his gaze, she offered a shy smile. "I'm sorry. I must look so out of place here." Jonathan shook his head, his voice low. "You don't. In fact, this might be the most right a dinner table has ever felt to me." Rebecca blinked in surprise. Sophie grinned, and Noah, ever observant, looked back and forth between the two adults, then exclaimed with delight, "Sophie's dad eats steak just like my mum. They're so alike." Jonathan and Rebecca laughed, small, genuine, unguarded laughs that drew a few startled glances from nearby tables. It was a dinner no one had planned. No script, no carefully curated backdrop. Just two adults, two children, and a twist of fate that had woven their lives together, if only for an evening. In a world built on control and design, it was the unplanned that turned out to be unforgettable. Jonathan had never sat at a table where he wasn't the one steering the conversation, yet tonight everything was reversed. He spoke little. He didn't guide the rhythm of the evening or dictate its pace. Instead, he watched. He watched Noah beam with pride as he talked about his day at school, watched Sophie nod attentively and chime in with the occasional comment that made everyone at the table laugh. But more than anything, he watched Rebecca. She wasn't trying to impress. She didn't angle herself toward attention. She was simply being a mother, in the most instinctive and complete sense of the word. Each time Noah reached for food, she reminded him gently. When he drank water too fast, she placed her hand on his back without a word. And when a piece of steak proved too big for him, she didn't wait or ask for help. She quietly cut it down into smaller pieces, each one even, precise, and calm. Jonathan had seen nannies do this for Sophie. He had paid for staff, trained in etiquette and childcare, people who knew exactly how many pieces to cut, how to fold a napkin just so. But he had never seen it done with the softness he saw in Rebecca's eyes. She wasn't just cutting meat, she was caring. And that kind of care could not be hired, programmed, or bought. It had to be lived. He turned to Sophie, who was pushing mashed potatoes around her plate, slowly and a little clumsily. It hit him, then he didn't know what his daughter's favorite food was. He didn't know when she had started eating so quietly, or when she had learned to make herself small during mealtimes, not to trouble anyone. Rebecca glanced over, her voice gentle, half question, half offer. "Sophie, Would you like me to help you cut your meat? Sophie looked up at Jonathan as if waiting for permission. He nodded before he could think it through. She smiled and slid her plate over. Yes, thank you, miss. Rebecca. Rebecca cut her food just as she had for Noah. Not rushed, not slow, just steady and full of care. Sophie leaned in and whispered, Noah's mum is like a superhero. She does everything really fast. Jonathan didn't know how to respond. A strange feeling stirred in his chest, as though someone had gently tapped the deepest part of his being. For years, he had delegated every aspect of Sophie's life. Her meals were handled by a private chef, her education by top tutors, her bedtime by a rotation of nannies. He went to work, made deals, led teams, and stayed absent. He had believed that providing everything meant love. But now, as he watched his daughter lean against Rebecca's shoulder, her eyes fluttering closed in quiet trust, he understood something deeper. Rebecca looked over at him, her voice barely above a whisper. She reminds me of myself as a little girl, always quiet in crowds. Jonathan nodded slowly. I don't know what she likes to eat. I don't think I've ever asked. Rebecca didn't judge. Her eyes held no reproach, only quiet understanding. Being a parent, none of us get it right from the beginning. Sometimes it takes us years to learn the smallest habits of our children. Jonathan glanced over at Noah and Sophie, now playing a game of counting spoons, lost in their own simple world. No walls between them, no difference in where they came from, just two children who had found each other. He spoke quietly, as if confessing a truth to himself more than to anyone else. I thought I had given Sophie the best of everything, but maybe what she needs most is something I can't buy. Rebecca didn't answer. She simply placed a hand gently on Sophie's back, rubbing softly. The little girl's eyes closed, a faint smile curling on her lips as sleep tugged at her. The meal was winding down. No one rushed to leave. No one wanted to be the first to stand, because, though no one said it aloud, they all knew something had quietly begun to change. Not because they had planned it, but because, for a moment, their hearts had allowed space for one another. In something as small as cutting a piece of meat for a child, the walls between them had lowered. And in that moment, Jonathan Ellison, the man admired by many, respected, feared, envied, realized that warmth didn't live in reputation or power. It lived in the smallest acts done for those we love. And from that moment on, he knew that this dinner hadn't been part of a strategy to repair his public image. It was the beginning of something real, something he had kept at arm's length for far too long. Presence, closeness, and love, needing no words to be understood. Jonathan was just about to stand and signal for the check when, all at once, the chandeliers above seemed to dim before his eyes. The world around him blurred, the sounds of Sophie and Noah's laughter echoing like distant voices in a hollow room. A heavy pressure settled in his chest, his throat burned dry, and a subtle tremble began in his hands. Within seconds his head spun, and his body tilted forward, unsteady and slipping beyond his control. But before he could collapse against the cold marble floor of the restaurant, Rebecca was already on her feet. She reached across, arms firm yet careful, catching him with the quiet strength of someone who had done this before, someone used to being the one who must act. A hush began to ripple through the tables nearby. Some glanced over with mild curiosity. Others leaned in to whisper, their tones edged with judgment. A waiter, startled, rushed toward them, but Rebecca moved faster. She eased Jonathan back into his chair, one hand behind his neck to keep his airway clear, the other reaching into her purse with practiced speed. From a side pocket she pulled out a small packet of sugar, something she always carried for Noah in case his blood sugar dropped after gym class. "It's hypoglycemia," she said, her voice firm but calm. "Please bring a glass of cool water." Without waiting for a response, she tore open the packet, stirred the sugar into the water once it arrived, and brought it to Jonathan's lips. helping him drink it in small, careful sips. His face had gone pale, his lips dry, his breath short and ragged. His eyes remained open, but they were unfocused, glazed over with strain. Sophie stood frozen, her mouth clamped shut, her whole body trembling. Noah stepped beside her, took her hand without a word, as if his small fingers could keep hers from slipping. Rebecca kept her hand steady on Jonathan's shoulder, applying gentle, rhythmic pressure, anchoring him back to the moment. Slowly, his breathing began to regulate. His eyes cleared. The trembling in his hands eased. He blinked hard, tried to sit upright, and turned to look at her. His lips moved, attempting to speak, but the words didn't come. Rebecca gave him a faint smile. Just low blood sugar. From stress, probably skipping meals. It'll pass. A senior staff member from the restaurant arrived, panting, followed by a young event coordinator still clutching a headset, eyes wide with panic. "Mr. Ellison, would you like us to call an ambulance? We have a medical room if—" Jonathan shook his head weakly. "I'm fine," he whispered, but no one looked convinced. Around them, the hum of hushed conversations thickened. Phones had been raised, pictures were being taken. No doubt, somewhere in the city, someone was already typing out a post. Billionaire CEO collapses mid-dinner. Rebecca's gaze swept the room. She understood now. This wasn't just a man having a health scare. This was a public figure, collapsing during what was supposed to be a tightly managed media opportunity. Her eyes fell on Sophie, who hadn't let go of Noah's hand. Jonathan followed her gaze. For the first time he saw it, his daughter was shaking. Her eyes, wide and wet with fear, clung to Rebecca, as if she were the only steady ground in a shifting world. He reached for her, hand trembling, but Sophie instinctively pulled back, leaning into Rebecca's side instead. That small retreat struck him harder than the dizziness ever could. All these years, he had convinced himself that strength meant control, that showing no emotion was how he protected Sophie. He believed he had shielded her by being unshakable, by never faltering. But in this one unguarded moment, his daughter hadn't turned to him. She had turned to someone who knew how to comfort, how to listen, how to hold a child's fear without asking them to explain it. A mother. Someone who could read a child's unspoken needs and answer without hesitation. Jonathan looked back at Rebecca just as she gently rubbed Sophie's back, whispering something he couldn't quite hear. But whatever it was, it made Sophie nod and smile, small, uncertain but real. Then a voice rose from the next table, sharp, enough to cut through the room. "I heard Mr. Ellison was having health issues, but this is unexpected." The speaker was a woman in designer attire, her voice loud, deliberate. "It's concerning, really. Imagine the Ellison group being led by someone who can faint in the middle of dinner." Murmurs spread like a stain. Eyes narrowed. Cameras clicked again. Jonathan tried to rise, to respond, to reclaim control. But before he could speak, Rebecca turned. She didn't shout. Her expression wasn't angry, but there was something in her eyes, clarity, conviction, that silenced the entire room. "If someone collapses from pushing themselves beyond their limit to hold everything together, that's not weakness," she said calmly. "That's devotion, that's responsibility, that's a person giving more than their body was built to handle." For a moment, the air itself seemed to pause. No one expected such words to come from someone like her. But she stood there, calm and steady, with a quiet authority that needed no title. Jonathan looked at her, not as a man rescued, but as someone seeing courage in its most human form. Not the kind shaped by wealth or reputation, but the kind born from love, instinct, and the relentless strength of everyday endurance. And in that moment, he understood something he hadn't dared admit, not even to himself. Rebecca had saved him, not just his body, weary and overworked, but something deeper. the image of the father he had always wanted to be, but never quite knew how to become. The air inside Riverstone Prime had thickened, heavy with tension and unspoken judgment after the sharp remark from the older woman. The clinking of silverware had faded, replaced by sidelong glances and hushed whispers that were never quiet enough to hide the edge of cruelty. Some diners raised their brows with restrained amusement, others stared outright, as if waiting for the curtain to fall on a scene they assumed was nearing its end. Jonathan remained seated, his face pale, eyes fixed on Sophie, who was nestled close to Rebecca. But what churned in his chest wasn't the residue of physical weakness. It was something quieter, more unfamiliar. A kind of shame, not loud or theatrical, but slow and aching. A feeling he had never known in boardrooms or hostile negotiations. Rebecca kept her hand gently on Sophie's back, offering wordless comfort. She didn't respond to the woman. She didn't defend herself or him. Her silence, calm and unwavering, was its own kind of strength, and Jonathan, strangely, felt shielded by it. Then, something unexpected happened. Sophie, still tucked close to Rebecca, suddenly stood. She looked directly at the woman who had spoken, her small frame steady, her voice quiet but clear. "My dad is not weak," she said. "He's strong, but he's also a person. And today, he's tired." The room stilled. Every eye turned to her. A little girl, 7 years, old, hair tied in a neat bun, wearing a simple white dress, now stood in the center of a 5-star restaurant, facing a sea of adults who had looked at her like she didn't belong. But Sophie didn't falter. She took a breath, turned slightly to glance up at Rebecca. "She helped my dad. And she helped me too. I think she's a superhero." Noah immediately stepped up beside her. "My mum is a superhero," he said proudly. "She works all day. She knows how to cook, fix the sink, help with homework. She doesn't have a fancy car or a housekeeper, but she's always there when I need her." Then he looked at Jonathan, eyes bright. "And Mr. Jonathan is good too. He doesn't have to be like anyone else. He just has to be Sophie's dad. That's enough." A soft laugh broke the silence, not mocking, not cruel, but warm, almost like relief, as if someone in the room had finally been pulled back from the edge of suspicion. The restaurant manager leaned discreetly toward Jonathan. "Sir, if you'd prefer, we can escort you to a private room more quiet, more controlled." Jonathan shook his head slowly. "No need." His eyes stayed on the 2 children, who stood like small guardians, untrained, unpolished, and utterly sincere. Children didn't know how to manipulate or perform. They didn't weigh consequences before they spoke. That made their words truer than any statement he could have crafted. He stood, slowly, but with steady feet. The dizziness was gone. His hands no longer trembled. "I'm all right," he said. But it was Sophie he looked at. "Thank you, Sophie." She smiled and reached for Rebecca's hand. "I don't want to leave yet, Daddy. I want to finish dinner with Miss Rebecca and Noah." Jonathan nodded. But it wasn't just permission. It was a quiet vow that he would no longer let whispers from strangers dictate the shape of his daughter's heart, that he would no longer confuse control with care, silence with strength. Once again, he felt a quiet wave of gratitude toward Rebecca. She had steadied him in a moment of vulnerability, not with grand gestures, but with calm, unfailing humanity. She had protected not just his health, but something deeper, his dignity. But it was the children who had taught him the night's most enduring lesson, that courage doesn't always wear armor or speak in declarations. Sometimes it simply tells the truth when others stay silent. Sometimes it stands up in a crowded room and defends what is right. Sometimes it loves, even when love feels exposed and inconvenient. Jonathan sat back down, no longer the center of power in a meeting, no longer the man who dictated the flow of the room. He was just a father who had been reminded by two small, unfiltered hearts of what actually matters. And on this strange, unscripted evening, he understood something he'd somehow forgotten in all his years chasing success. That often, the bravest hearts are the smallest ones. Dinner ended in a way no one could have anticipated. There were no camera flashes clicking as the media team had once envisioned, no grand departure with Jonathan Ellison, flanked by assistants and event staff, projecting power and polish. Instead, he left quietly, walking side by side with Rebecca, Sophie, and Noah through the main entrance of Riverstone Prime, like any other father heading home after an evening spent with family friends. The night air was cool, the breeze gentle, the rustling of the trees sounding almost as if the city itself was whispering secrets. Jonathan asked his driver to wait, letting them stroll a little farther, down to the riverside path, where wooden benches sat under the broad canopy of old oak trees. The four of them sat there together, gazing out over the dark water that shimmered with the soft reflections of the city's golden lights. The children competed to skip small stones into the river, their laughter light and etched, untouched by the tension that had earlier filled the restaurant. Jonathan and Rebecca sat with a quiet space between them, not so far as to feel distant, not so close as to be unspoken, but just enough to feel each other's presence in the cool night air. He didn't speak at first. He sat still for a long moment, as if wrestling with something private and fragile inside him. Then finally, in a voice low and worn, he asked not to her, but almost to himself, "Have you ever felt like you live in a big house, but not a single room in it belongs to you?" Rebecca turned to look at him, surprised by the sudden intimacy of the question. She didn't answer. Not yet. She waited, giving him the silence to go on. "I used to think that success would bring freedom," he continued, eyes still fixed on the water. "But the higher I climbed, the more I felt trapped. Every decision I make has to be right. Every emotion has to be hidden. Every step I take is followed, examined, spun into a story." He paused, then pulled a handkerchief from his pocket and dabbed the sweat still lingering faintly on his brow. "My wife died from a post-surgery complication. It was supposed to be a routine procedure. No one expected anything to go wrong. I was speaking at a medical conference in Europe. I didn't make it back in time. When I arrived, Sophie was in the nanny's arms. My wife was gone." Rebecca said nothing. She placed her hands quietly on her knees, listening. She understood this wasn't a moment for sympathy, not the hollow, reflexive kind. It wasn't a time for platitudes. It was a time to simply sit with someone's truth. Jonathan looked down at his polished shoes he had chosen carefully that morning, ones that projected the exact image required for a media-facing dinner. Now, speckled with dust from the riverbank, they seemed strangely out of place. "I adopted Sophie because she's the daughter of my best friend from university. He died on duty. I thought, taking her in was my way of honoring that bond. Maybe even my way of making up for not being there when my wife died. But somewhere along the way, I turned that into a project." He gave a dry, hollow laugh, one aimed at himself. "I hired the best caregivers, bought all the educational toys, scheduled her learning plans, tracked her developmental metrics. But I never once sat down and asked her what color she likes best, or what she's afraid of." Rebecca turned toward him. In the dim halo of a nearby street lamp, his face was no longer the smooth, composed mask she had seen in magazines. There were lines now, creases that told of loss, of sleepless nights, of battles fought in silence. Beneath the image of the invincible executive was a man who had known pain, but had learned too well how to hide it. "I didn't expect to collapse tonight," he said quietly. "I've spent years keeping everything under control. But when Sophie ran not to me, but to you, I realized I've never truly been her safe place." He brought a hand to his eyes, shielding the dampness there. "I thought what I feared most was losing control. But what really broke me was realizing that even at my weakest, no one knew how to hold me like a father who just needed to be held. Rebecca exhaled softly. You've built very tall walls around yourself, Jonathan. But children don't need fortresses. They just need someone who will sit next to them, listen to nonsense stories, cut their steak into pieces, and be there when they wake from a nightmare. She looked at him, not with hesitation, but with the quiet strength of someone who had survived her own storms. You don't need to be perfect. You just need to be present. Jonathan looked back toward the water, where the pebbles tossed by the children still sent out ripples across the surface. For a moment he marveled at the vulnerability he had just shown to someone who, only hours ago, was a stranger. And yet, there was no shame in it. In fact, he felt lighter than he had in years. As if, by sitting beside a single mother who had learned to carry her world on her shoulders, he had finally allowed himself to put down the weight of pretending to be untouchable. Perhaps this moment, quiet, unglamorous, unplanned, was the beginning of something. Not an image to manage, not a narrative to control, but a return to something far simpler, far more real. A man stepping out from behind his fortress, a father trying at last to be there. Jonathan continued to sit still, his eyes fixed on the river, where the city's golden lights shimmered on the surface, drifting in and out of view like flickers of thought he couldn't quite hold on to. Beside him, Rebecca said nothing. They sat together in the quiet, two people from vastly different worlds, sharing a silence that asked for nothing more than to be shared. No explanation, no urgency, just presence. Eventually, as the children wandered farther down the path, chasing the last fallen leaves of the season, Rebecca spoke. Her voice was even, steady, each word released with the care of someone who had carried them a long time. I used to be a nurse. Jonathan turned to her, surprise softening the lines of his face. Rebecca offered a faint smile, as if anticipating his reaction. It's something I stopped talking about years ago. I graduated with honors, landed a position at one of the best hospitals in the city. In the beginning, I thought I'd found my purpose. I cared for patients, pulled night shifts, took extra certifications. I truly believed medicine was where I'd spend the rest of my life. She paused, brushing a dry leaf from Sophie's hair and placing it gently into the girl's open palm. Sophie's fingers closed around it without looking. Then I met my husband. He was a firefighter, tall, funny, always the kind of man who made room for others first. We got married too, years after we met. When Noah was born, he was the first to hold him in the delivery room. I was still wearing my nursing shoes, still in my mask. I had just come from a shift in the ER. Jonathan listened, not just with his ears, but with something deeper, attuned to the subtle breaks in her tone, the weight behind her stillness. One morning, he was called to a house fire in the outskirts, she continued. I remember he promised he'd be back early, said he wanted to take Noah to the park. But he didn't come back. Her voice quieted but did not falter. A piece of the roof collapsed. He didn't have time to move. I was at work when I got the call. By the time I reached the hospital, they wouldn't let me into the trauma room. But I knew exactly what was happening behind those doors. I could hear the monitors, the codes being called, the rhythm of voices in crisis. I knew they were doing everything they could, but I also knew they wouldn't be able to save him. She took a slow breath, pushing the weight of the memory back just far enough to speak clearly. I stood in that hallway, in the same hospital where I had worked for years, and for the first time in my life, I felt completely powerless. I couldn't save him. I couldn't explain it to Noah, who didn't even understand what not coming home meant. In one morning, I lost my husband, my best friend, my partner. Jonathan leaned slightly forward, his face darkened not with judgment or pity, but with a quiet empathy that didn't need words. Rebecca continued, and now her voice carried something deeper, something scarred but still alive. After the funeral, I went back to the hospital, but it wasn't the same. I couldn't separate myself anymore. Every patient reminded me of him. Every emergency felt personal. I became slow, unsure. Eventually, I handed in my resignation. She glanced toward Noah, who was crouched near the water, tossing stones with Sophie, their laughter echoing softly in the still air. I started working in diners, driving deliveries at night. Anything that let me stay close to Noah. I didn't want him in daycare for 10 hours a day, just so I could still be called a nurse. Jonathan sat in silence. His chest tightened not with sorrow alone, but with a profound, bone-deep respect. Rebecca turned back to him. I lived with guilt for a long time, that I didn't keep my promise to the man I loved. But slowly, over the years, Noah helped me forgive myself, not with words, just by being Noah, the way he calls for me in the morning, the way he scans the crowd to find me after school, the way he smiles when I make him his favorite noodles. Little things, but they heal. Jonathan nodded slowly, not as a man used to being heard, but as one who was learning, truly learning, what it meant to listen. You didn't leave medicine, he said quietly. You just started healing in a different way. And that, boy, he's living proof of that. Rebecca smiled. It wasn't flawless, it wasn't polished, but it was honest. Honest in a way that pierced through years of Jonathan's carefully constructed image of strength. They looked at each other, not as CEO and single mother, not as symbols of success or struggle, but as two people who had known what it meant to break and still chose to show up for someone else. They didn't need titles or explanations. They only needed to be there, side by side, in the quiet. And in that stillness, under the watchful hush of night and the whispering trees, Jonathan realized he had just received a confession, one without apology, yet more healing than any remedy he had ever been prescribed. It did not ask for sympathy. It offered truth, and in return it invited him to put down his own armor, to simply be. The night breeze swept gently across the river, carrying with it the damp scent of water and the quiet rustle of dry leaves skimming. Across the stone-paved sidewalk, Rebecca reached to wrap a light scarf around Sophie's shoulders, then leaned toward Noah and asked softly if he felt cold. The boy shook his head, still lost in the task of collecting small stones, his eyes lit with the pure wonder of a child, unbothered by the world's weight. Jonathan watched them, three figures framed by the soft glow of street lamps, and felt something stir inside him. It was a sensation unfamiliar, yet oddly close. A warmth that didn't come from high walls or central heating, but from something far simpler. A mother's quiet glance, a scarf gently draped, a hand resting near a child's. And then, almost without thinking, his voice broke through the silence, low and uncertain. Would you all like to come to my place tonight, just for a cup of hot cocoa, so the kids don't have to head home too late in the cold? Rebecca turned to him, surprised. Are you sure it's not an inconvenience? Jonathan shook, his head, his expression softer than it had been all evening. I don't think I've ever made a more reasonable invitation. The morning sunlight streamed through the tall glass windows of Jonathan's estate, casting soft golden stripes across the polished hardwood floor. Where silence once reigned like a shadow stitched into the walls, the house now pulsed with life. Sophie and Noah's footsteps echoed through the halls as they ran, laughing, in search of toothbrushes. In the kitchen, Rebecca prepared a simple breakfast with the children, the quiet hum of a new day settling gently over everything. Jonathan sat at the dining table, a cup of coffee cooling slowly in his hand, his gaze distant, far beyond the manicured lawn outside. There was something in his stillness, not weary, but thoughtful, a man who had glimpsed another life, and was now measuring its weight against the one he had built. But the calm didn't last. The shrill tone of his phone shattered the morning rhythm. The sound repeated, insistent. Jonathan picked it up, and the moment he saw the caller ID, his private office line, his expression shifted. The voice on the other end was low, urgent, and edged with unease. It was his personal assistant. There was an emergency. A board meeting had been called immediately. No delay. Something serious had happened. He said nothing at first, just listened, jaw tightening ever so slightly. Then he turned, just as Rebecca approached, wiping her hands on a towel, sensing something in his posture. "I have to go," he said, voice quieter than usual. "Seems like someone out there wasn't too happy about me having a peaceful evening." Rebecca didn't ask what had happened. She placed a hand gently on his shoulder. "You're not going alone." And in that simple phrase, Jonathan felt something that had eluded him for years, not support tied to power or status, not loyalty bought by contracts or compensation, but companionship. Not long after, the black car pulled up in front of the glass tower that housed the headquarters of Ellison Group. Jonathan stepped out, flanked by Rebecca and the two children, their presence quiet but unwavering. Inside, at the top floor, the boardroom was already full. The atmosphere, once collegial, now crackled with unease. Faces he had known for years, strategists, investors, legal advisors, looked at him not with camaraderie, but calculation. Eyes that once admired him now scanned for weakness. No greetings, no pleasantries. At the center of the room, a large screen flickered to life. Without preamble, a video began to play. It was him, Jonathan Ellison, seated at Riverstone Prime. The footage showed his face pale, his posture unsteady. The moment he lost his balance. The seconds where Rebecca rushed to his side. The silent chaos of a man once seen as unshakable, caught in the act of being human. No audio, no context, just light and shadow. Just a powerful man collapsing in public. The video played again, then again, as if replaying it could make his vulnerability more damning. As if the absence of sound erased the truth of what the camera never caught: the fear in Sophie's eyes, the calm of Rebecca's hands, the unguarded moment when he realized what it meant to be seen, not just looked at. He looked around the room. The polished table stretched long, reflecting stiff faces and crossed arms. No one spoke first. They were waiting for a reaction, for an explanation, or for him to crack. But for the first time, Jonathan wasn't standing in front of them with a rehearsed pitch or a legal defense. He was just standing, as he was, not flawless, not infallible, just real. And somewhere behind him, out of sight of the board's scrutiny, stood a woman who hadn't left, and two children who had no reason to defend him but would, without hesitation. The night before had given him something no quarterly report ever had. Now came the moment to decide what it was worth. At the head of the long table, Gerald Sterling, vice chairman of the board, and a man whose quiet ambition to replace Jonathan had long been an open secret, cleared his throat with theatrical gravity before speaking. "I believe we don't need further evidence," he began, his voice smooth, deliberate, and loud enough to echo slightly off the glass walls. The head of a corporation the size of Ellison, collapsing in public, with the footage now circulating across every corner of the internet like a punchline. Can we truly still place our trust and our leadership in someone who loses control so easily? A murmur spread across the room like a ripple. Faces turned from the screen to Jonathan, then to Sterling, as if waiting for a verdict already whispered behind closed doors. Jonathan remained silent. He let the stillness hold. His eyes drifted slowly across the room, the same room that had once been the beating heart of his empire. Every polished surface, every leather chair held echoes of late nights, hard choices, victories carved from nothing. He had built Ellison from the ground up, brick by brick, deal by deal. But now, it seemed, one moment of human fragility might be enough to bring it all crashing down. Beneath the table, Rebecca gently squeezed his hand, then gave him a small, steady nod. He understood. This wasn't just about defending his title. It was about reclaiming something deeper, his humanity, his voice, his right to be more than the image they had come to expect. Jonathan rose from his seat. He didn't rush. He didn't raise his voice. But the stillness in the room shifted, drawn to the calm clarity in his eyes. "I won't deny the video," he said, his voice even, resonant. "Yes, that was me. That was a moment when I was exhausted. But let me ask you this. Have none of you ever felt so tired, so hollow, that you wanted to stop, even just for a second? Have none of you, after decades of bearing the weight of a corporation, ever reached the edge of your own limits?" He looked around, letting the silence stretch. If a single moment of weakness is enough to disqualify a man, then what exactly did we build this company on? On carefully curated perfection? Or on the truth that we are, first and foremost, human? The room grew still. Even the most skeptical expressions faltered. But Sterling wasn't finished. He slapped a folder onto the table with sharp finality. "You're twisting the narrative. This is a business, not a therapy group. We need strength, stability. A CEO who doesn't crack under pressure." Jonathan turned to him, the steel in his gaze suddenly unmistakable. "I didn't crack from pressure," he said coldly. "I collapsed because I lived like a machine for too many years. And last night, for the first time in my life, I remembered what it felt like to live as a man." He walked forward, opened his briefcase, and placed a thick dossier on the table. Inside is the revised workforce plan for next quarter, a full forecast of projected growth, and an outline of a long-term innovation strategy that, as of this morning, no one else in this room has seen. "I prepared it myself, before sunrise, after everything." He let the words settle. "I am still working, still leading, still thinking farther ahead than most of you. But if this board would rather replace me simply because I allowed myself one moment of vulnerability, then go ahead, vote. But remember this, no one can truly lead people if they have never allowed themselves to feel what it means to be one." The room was quiet, too quiet. The tension had turned. The certainty that had bloomed in Sterling's tone was now waning, splintered by something none of them had prepared for. Truth, spoken plainly and without shame. Jonathan sat back down, his hands resting calmly before him. He offered no further defense. He didn't need to, because today he had done more than protect his role. He had reclaimed his dignity, and in doing so, he reminded the people seated around that polished table, those who worshipped resilience at the cost of compassion, that true strength is not in never faltering, it's in knowing when to stand back up. As Jonathan took his seat, the room remained hushed, the silence thick with something not easily named. Around the table, eyes that once measured him only by market forecasts and quarterly margins now looked at him differently. Not as a CEO who had stumbled, but as a man who had allowed his truest self to surface right in the heart of a place that demanded nothing but precision and control. And then, breaking through that stillness, Rebecca rose to her feet. She wore no tailored suit, held no presentation slides, wielded no official title. Just a woman in a pale shirt, standing tall with the quiet gravity of someone who had weathered real loss and survived it. Her voice was soft, but each word landed like stone in water, rippling through the room. "I'm sorry to interrupt," she began, "but I believe there's something this room needs to hear, not from someone in finance, not from someone with shares, and certainly not someone with voting power. I'm just a mother." Her gaze moved calmly to Gerald Sterling. There was no challenge in her eyes, only the calm defiance of someone who had nothing to prove but everything to say. "I was once a nurse. I've cared for hundreds of patients when they were healing and when they were fading. And if I learned one thing in all those years, it's this: people are not weakest when they lose control. They are weakest when there's no one left to stand beside them." She took a single step forward, her voice growing stronger, more unwavering with every breath. Last night, when Jonathan Ellison collapsed in that restaurant, it wasn't because he lacked leadership or discipline. It was because he'd been living for far too long in a world that never allowed him to simply breathe. A world where if you panic, you're called weak. If you pause to hear your child laugh, you're deemed distracted. If you grieve for someone you loved, you're labeled unfit to lead. Around the table, the board members began to shift. Glances flicked between one another. Some leaned back, reflective. Others lowered their eyes in thought. Sterling straightened, his mouth tightening, eyes narrowing, ready to interrupt. But Rebecca didn't let him. You worry the public will see a CEO who isn't perfect, but I ask you, what reaches people more? An image made of steel, or the truth of a person who feels, who falls, and who gets back up? Her voice softened just enough, breaking at the edge of emotion, but she held herself steady. I'm not here to defend a powerful man, I'm here to speak for a father. A man my son calls a hero, not because of wealth or power, but because he listens. Because he made a room feel warmer with nothing more than his presence. Her last words trembled slightly, not from weakness, but from the weight of truth spoken from the heart. She didn't cry. She didn't falter. She stood as a woman who had been shaped by life's sharp edges and had found, somehow, the courage to remain soft. Jonathan looked at her, no longer surprised, only moved. For the first time, perhaps, he fully grasped the strength that lived in Rebecca, not loud, not political, not rehearsed, but real. And in that moment, her words did what no graph or market analysis ever could. They made the room listen. A board member, an older woman seated quietly in the far corner, lowered her pen and nodded. Slowly. Another, a younger man with sharp features and ambition in his eyes, turned to look at Sterling, uncertainty now clouding his once confident gaze. Rebecca let out a slow breath. I've seen strong people break because no one arrived in time to stand with them, she said, voice now low but firm. I won't let that happen to Jonathan. Not because he's a CEO, but because he's a father learning, finally, how to love again. She sat down, gently taking Sophie's hand, who had been standing quietly by her side. The room didn't erupt in applause, but it didn't need to. Something deeper had shifted. Rebecca's presence had cooled the fever of control and fear that hung in the air. Her words weren't strategy, they were clarity. And in a boardroom where power was usually won through dominance or fear, tonight the most powerful moment came from a woman who stood up not for influence, but for love. Jonathan turned toward her. The gratitude in his eyes was quiet, but absolute. Not just for defending him, but for showing an entire room of decision-makers that the strongest twist doesn't come from titles or leverage. It comes from someone brave enough to speak when everyone else stays silent. It comes from a mother who stands at the exact moment the world needs reminding what humanity looks like. The boardroom was silent, dense with the weight of truth just unveiled. Jonathan remained seated, still absorbing the impact of what had unfolded. Around him, the atmosphere had shifted completely. Just moments ago, his leadership had hung by a thread. Now, that thread had become a lifeline, one woven by integrity and quiet courage. Jonathan slowly rose to his feet. He didn't look at the board members with anger, but with a calm authority that he hadn't possessed when he walked in. Rebecca just reminded all of us, Jonathan said, his voice resonant, that leadership isn't just about making decisions in a boardroom, it's about who stands for you when no one else does. And who chooses truth, even when it's inconvenient. He turned to face Sterling. This was never just about a fall in a restaurant. It was about who we become when we think no one's watching. Today, you saw who was watching all along. Not to destroy, but to protect what matters most. Sterling, now seated with shoulders slack and gaze unfocused, said nothing. Whatever defense he might have crafted had crumbled, not because of data or strategy, but because the room had lost respect for him. A formal vote followed. It was swift, firm, and final. Sterling was suspended, pending a full legal review. The board, though still stunned, began murmuring in a tone now coloured with respect for Jonathan, not fear. The board, though still stunned, began murmuring in a tone now coloured with respect, not fear. As the room began to clear, Jonathan walked over to Daniel and extended his hand. It was more than a gesture, it was an acknowledgment, a symbol of the kind of leadership he now knew he needed to embrace. "I built this company from nothing," Jonathan said quietly, "but today you rebuilt something even more valuable. Trust." Daniel took his hand, his nod subtle. "You did the harder part. You let people see who you really are." Behind them, the windows of the high-rise reflected a city still spinning with ambition and noise. But inside that room, something rare had just taken place. Not a fight for dominance, not a show of strength, but the reclaiming of dignity, and the quiet triumph of those who protect what's right without needing applause. Outside, the sunlight filtered in through the tall glass panes, casting long beams across the polished floor. It was morning, in every sense of the word. And though the night before had nearly unraveled Jonathan's life, it had also begun to stitch something far more lasting back together, not his reputation, but his humanity. As the weight of the boardroom lifted behind them, the hallway outside felt strangely quiet, as if the building itself had exhaled. Jonathan walked not like a man who had just survived a corporate coup, but like someone who had finally laid down an invisible burden he had carried for far too long. There was no armor in his posture now, no practiced stride of a CEO stepping into another meeting. He simply stood there, still, reflective, and human. His eyes lingered on Daniel, the man who, until 2 days ago, had been a stranger. There was no formal gratitude spoken, no theatrical gesture of recognition. But in that silence, Jonathan's gaze held something deeper, a kind of reverence not often exchanged between men in suits, not for a favor owed, but for a truth delivered. Beside him, Rebecca stood with a quiet steadiness. She no longer looked at him as someone who needed help, but as someone she recognized. Someone who, beneath the tailored jacket and decades of headlines, had finally shown the part of himself the world rarely saw. The part that bleeds, the part that bends, the part that dares to care. Across the waiting area, Sophie and Noah chased each other between chairs, their laughter echoing in bursts that belonged to another world, a freer, simpler world that no corporate meeting could touch. Jonathan watched them, and without turning his head spoke softly, as if to himself, but loud enough for all to hear. "Presence," he said, "is the only currency that never loses its value." Rebecca turned slowly toward him. She didn't need to answer. The slight, knowing nod she gave was more than enough. That one sentence had rewritten something in both of them. They didn't return to the office that day. Jonathan didn't want power lunches or high-rise skyline views. Instead, he asked for something simpler, something real, a modest lunch. No white tablecloths, no silver utensils, no polished speeches. Just a small, family-owned diner on the outskirts of Chicago, one Rebecca had taken Sophie to on quiet weekends. There, in the corner booth, with cracked leather seats and mismatched mugs, they sat down, not as CEO and guest, but as people who had come through a storm together. Jonathan ordered without looking at the price, but because, for the first time, he realized value was measured differently here. In the sound of a child's laughter, in the smell of something warm, handmade, unpretentious. The waitress brought their food. Sophie looked at her burger, slightly too big for her hands. Before Rebecca could reach over, Jonathan picked up the knife. His movements were a little clumsy. At first he was used to signing million-dollar contracts, not cutting sandwiches, but he carefully sliced the burger into manageable quarters. Sophie leaned her head gently against Jonathan's shoulder between bites. Every now and then, her hand reached for his arm, not out of habit, but out of trust. Jonathan watched her, and something in his chest tugged hard. He turned to Rebecca, his voice low and raw. "When I was younger, I believed time was something I could earn back. That being absent, today could be offset by a grand gesture tomorrow. But I was wrong." Rebecca didn't interrupt. She let the silence fill in the spaces where pain still echoed. "I had everything," Jonathan continued. "The name, the power, but I have no real memories of Sophie's first years. I thought if I provided enough, she'd understand. But I realize now, children aren't supposed to understand. They're supposed to be accompanied." Rebecca's fingers traced the rim of her glass slowly. "Sometimes presence doesn't need explaining, it just needs repeating, like a lullaby that never goes out of tune." Jonathan lowered his head slightly. He had spent a lifetime gathering titles, building empires, mastering the illusion of control. But in this quiet corner of a humble diner, he had learned something no textbook could teach. That presence, however ordinary, was the most extraordinary gift of all. Lunch ended slowly, with no rush to move on, no glances at watches or vibrating phones to interrupt the stillness. When they stepped out of the little restaurant, sunlight poured through the thinning canopy of trees, casting golden lace across the quiet street like a blessing only autumn could offer. Jonathan reached down and took Noah's hand, and for the first time, the boy didn't pull away. It was a small gesture, but it carried the quiet weight of something mended. Sophie, ever curious, leaned close to Rebecca and whispered, "Mom, do you think Mr. Jonathan will have lunch with us again?" Rebecca smiled, brushing a strand of hair from her daughter's cheek. "I think next time," she said gently, "you'll be the one picking the place." Then she looked at Jonathan. He didn't say a word. He didn't need to. His nod was steady, his eyes speaking a promise far stronger than anything spoken aloud. That afternoon, no contracts were signed, no negotiations held, but something deeper was agreed upon. A silent contract, invisible and eternal. A promise to show up, to place people before titles, and to recognize that in a world where almost anything can be bought or traded, time spent together remains utterly priceless. Later that day, under the soft twilight of a late October evening in Chicago, as scattered leaves danced across the stone path leading into the headquarters of Ellison Group, Jonathan stood at the glass wall of the top-floor boardroom, watching his own reflection shimmer back at him. In his hands was a folder not marked urgent or confidential, but carrying the most meaningful decision of his career, not because it was strategic or profitable, but because it was human. Rebecca was now officially part of the company's senior leadership, not because Jonathan owed her anything, not because she lobbied for power or position, but because he knew instinctively, deeply, that she was the missing piece the organization didn't even realize it needed. And when she stepped into the office that day, she was not the hesitant woman who had stumbled unexpectedly into a world of polished floors and tailored suits. She brought with her a quiet authority, the kind born not of title but of truth. Integrity, presence, and compassion, those were the things she carried. And the company, for the first time in a long while, felt whole. Jonathan placed the folder on the desk and gently slid it toward her. "This contract," he said softly, "is unlike any I've ever signed. It's not just a job offer, it's an invitation to a family." Rebecca's eyes widened slightly, surprised but unshaken. She opened the folder, flipped through the first few pages, then looked up. "Jonathan," she said, her voice steady, "are you sure? I don't have an MBA. I've never run a corporation. I've changed bandages, taken vitals, and stayed up through the night holding my son during a fever. That's all I know." Jonathan smiled, really smiled for the first time in weeks. "And that's exactly why I need you. I don't need another strategist. I have plenty of those. I need a head of people and culture. I need someone to look after the people who work for me, the same way you looked after me and Sophie. Rebecca looked at the contract again. The title wasn't about profits, it was about wellness, mental health, and human connection. She looked up at him, her voice calm but firm. I'll say yes. But on one condition. He raised a brow. Name it. I won't sit in an office all day reading metrics. I want to walk the halls. I want to know the people, what keeps them awake at night, what they're proud of, if they are burning out. If I can't do that, I can't help you. Jonathan nodded without hesitation. Done. You won't work the old way. This is a new chapter, and it needs to be written in a new language. And so, in a quiet room that had seen more numbers than names, more strategy than soul, something truly new began, not just for the company, but for both of them. There was no applause, no champagne, no ribbon to cut, just a mutual understanding that the real work, the human work, was only just beginning. And it would be led by someone who remembered what mattered, someone who had lived through the silence of grief and the noise of uncertainty and still chose to show up, not as a symbol, but as herself. That afternoon, they left the office without an entourage, without luxury cars waiting at the curb, without reporters trailing behind. Jonathan drove them himself, hands steady on the wheel, as the city gave way to quieter streets. In the back seat, Noah was busy telling Sophie about his new playroom, how they were going to build a fortress out of blankets and pillows, how it needed secret codes and a snack drawer. Rebecca glanced at Jonathan through the rearview mirror. You once said CEOs shouldn't waste time driving their kids to school or cooking dinner, she said softly. Do you still believe that? Jonathan smiled faintly and shook his head. I used to believe a lot of things that were wrong. That evening, at the Ellison estate by Lake Michigan, there was no gala, no clinking champagne flutes, no curated guest list, just a quiet dinner. Rebecca baked lasagna. Noah made garlic bread from a recipe he found online. Sophie sang as she chopped vegetables for salad, every off-key note a little burst of joy. They sat around the table without checking the time, without glancing at emails. And when laughter echoed after Noah's dramatic retelling of the popcorn explosion in the microwave, Jonathan looked around and really saw for the first time that this house had finally become a home. The cold corners had softened. The silence, once oppressive, now hummed with warmth. What once was merely expensive square footage was now filled with something irreplaceable. Life. After dinner, Sophie tugged at Rebecca's sleeve, leaned in, and whispered, Mum, I think you and Mr. Jonathan are like superheroes. Rebecca smiled, brushing her daughter's hair behind her ear. Why do you say that? Not because you're strong, Sophie said, but because you make everything feel safe. Rebecca kissed her daughter's forehead. Then you're my smallest superhero, she whispered. At the window, Jonathan stood quietly, gazing out at the lake. The surface of the water was still, reflecting the soft, golden glow of the house behind him, like a memory he didn't know he was allowed to keep. Rebecca stepped up beside him. Her hand, without thought, found his arm. It wasn't calculated. It was instinctive, familiar, necessary. This wasn't just a new role. This was something deeper than title or office space. It was the beginning of something that didn't yet have a name, but already had a shape. Jonathan turned toward her, voice low, steady, real. I didn't bring you here just to work, he said. I want you here. I want us to build something where our kids don't have to trade their childhoods for our ambition. Rebecca didn't answer with words. She didn't need to. Her fingers found his, curled around his hand, and held on. That small gesture said everything, a silent yes, a vow not signed on paper, but imprinted on something far more enduring. A new chapter had begun, not just in their work, but in their hearts. The next morning, Sunlight streamed gently through the curtains of the lakefront villa's living room, scattering across the polished wood floors like golden dust. In the playroom, once a cold and silent space, laughter now echoed like a song long overdue. Noah and Sophie sat amid a fortress of pillows, blankets, toys, and picture books, building a citadel from grey flannel throws and overturned chairs. Sophie worked carefully, tying the corners of a blanket with a piece of ribbon she had found in a craft box, while Noah lined up a convoy of toy cars outside, their gate. Both children were immersed in their world, and yet in their eyes was the unmistakable light of a joy found only when childhood is shared. Sophie looked up, brushed a bead of sweat from her forehead, and asked with the frankness only a child could summon, "Noah, do you think, if my mum and your dad lived together, would that make us brother and sister?" Her voice was casual, but the thought had clearly lingered from the night before, when she had watched her mother and Jonathan sharing something unspoken but warm. Noah paused, his hands mid-air above a toy truck. He considered her question seriously, then answered slowly, "Maybe. If my mum was your mum too, then yeah, you'd be my little sister. But my mum is still my mum, and your mum is still yours." Sophie grinned. "Then maybe we're not real siblings. Just unofficial ones." Noah frowned thoughtfully, like an old man pondering something profound, then nodded. "Yeah, like allies, superheroes on the same team." The two children high-fived, sealing their pact with laughter that rippled across the room like sunshine. They didn't need paperwork to be family. They just needed love, and the feeling of safety in a grown-up's arms or glance. From the kitchen, Rebecca stepped out, holding 2 warm cups of milk. She paused at the doorway, watching the children whisper and giggle like they were planning to save the world. Behind her, Jonathan approached quietly and placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "They act like they've lived together forever," he said softly. Rebecca smiled, her voice light but woven with meaning. "Children don't need time to know they're loved. They just need to feel seen and heard." Suddenly Noah turned around and called out, "Dad, Mum, come see our secret base." Rebecca and Jonathan looked at each other, then walked over. The children led them proudly into the blanket fort, where a hand-drawn map hung on the inside wall, along with a plate of cookies and a piece of paper with bold crayon-scrawled letters, "No one left behind Alliance." Sophie pointed to it and said, "We made this, so if someone's sad, they can come in. Here, nobody gets to be alone." Jonathan stood frozen for a moment, the words striking something deep in him, like the echo of a melody he'd never known he was missing. Slowly, he knelt and pulled Sophie into his arms. "You just taught me something I never learned," he whispered, "not in all my years of being a CEO." And in that quiet morning light, within the soft walls of a child-built fortress, a man who had led empires found something far more enduring, a belonging no title could offer, and a lesson no boardroom could teach. That afternoon, the whole little family took a walk along the edge of the lake. No one wore the polished armor of pretenses or the careful shields of distance. Rebecca walked barefoot on the grass, her hand tightly entwined with Jonathan's. The 2 children ran ahead, chasing each other between rows of maple trees that had begun to blush with the first signs of autumn. When Sophie tripped on a tree root and fell forward, Noah turned back immediately, offering his hand to pull her up and gently brushing the dirt from her knees, just like a real brother would. Rebecca held her breath. That moment was brief, fleeting even, but in its quiet honesty, it told her everything she needed to know. She had been right to trust Jonathan, not because of his position or wealth, but because of the way he was raising Noah to love, to care, to be kind. As the sun slipped behind the trees and the lake shimmered under a wash of soft orange light, Sophie dropped down onto the grass, gazed up at the sky, then turned to Noah. "If someday your dad marries my mom, will we have to share our toys?" Noah laughed. "Yes, but I'll teach you how to play the hard ones." Sophie clapped her hands. Then it's a deal. That's it. We're a family now. Rebecca and Jonathan looked at each other, eyes brimming with tears beneath their shared laughter. Love does not always need to be loud. Sometimes it begins with a simple question from a child's heart. Are we siblings now? And from that moment on, every answer was yes. On the first morning in the villa, after Noah and Sophie had officially declared themselves not quite siblings, but something close enough, sunlight streamed through the tall dining room windows, bathing the space in a strange, gentle warmth. Rebecca woke up in the guest room, yet for the first time, the space did not feel foreign. The smell of something freshly baked drifted through the halls, guiding her toward a scene that tightened her chest with emotion. Jonathan stood at the stove, sleeves rolled, hair gently tousled, hands moving quickly as he poured milk and spread butter on toast for the two children perched awkwardly on their tall chairs. Sophie whispered something into Noah's ear, making him laugh, and together they shouted good morning in a burst of sound that filled the house with life. Rebecca stood still, one hand lightly resting on the doorframe, her throat thick with feeling. She had never imagined that a breakfast table, a quiet scene of family, could bring her such healing. Jonathan turned, caught her gaze, and smiled softly, a smile that carried no grand gesture, only the quiet certainty of trust. He set down the glass of milk and walked toward her, murmuring, "Rebecca, this is the first time in many years this house has felt lived in." She replied quietly, "And it's the first time I've felt welcomed in a place not out of pity or curiosity." They looked at each other and said nothing more, but in that silence, their eyes spoke for them, piecing back together the parts of themselves that had long gone missing, one fragile bit at a time. That day, there were no meetings on the calendar, no urgent calls to return, no financial strategies to finalize or legal documents to review. Instead, Rebecca made a suggestion that caught everyone off guard. She proposed they repaint the playroom. Jonathan laughed, thinking she was joking. But when he saw her rolling up her sleeves and already dabbing paint onto her arm, he had no choice but to go find the paint rollers. The two children were bursting with excitement, as though embarking on a secret mission. Noah began drawing a spaceship on the wall, and Sophie added a flying dragon to protect it. Jonathan chimed in with a name for their little creative world. He called it the Family Space Station. Rebecca looked around at the chaotic swirl of colors and couldn't help but laugh out loud. By midday, they sat outside for lunch under the wide shade of a tree that cooled the entire backyard. Rebecca brought out chicken sandwiches, a recipe she had once learned from an old colleague, and Jonathan carefully brewed iced tea with thin slices of lemon, just the way Sophie liked it. Noah animatedly told a story about a robot he planned to build from spare parts in the garage, and Sophie eagerly suggested they film a video tutorial on making banana ice cream. Jonathan listened closely, his eyes following every shift in his son's expression. For the first time in many years, he realized that life wasn't meant to be measured only in achievements, but in moments like these too. That afternoon, they all went grocery shopping together. It was something simple, almost mundane for most people, yet for Jonathan it felt like stepping into a life he had never imagined. He found himself choosing a loaf of bread based on the opinion of a 7-year-old girl, and buying strawberry ice cream simply because his son said it was his new mom's favorite. They laughed, pushed the cart past the aisles like a family that had been doing this for years, and when they returned home, each person had a small task in the kitchen to help prepare dinner. The meal that evening was nothing elaborate, just spaghetti, salad, and a few pieces of fruit. But the laughter, that was endless. When Noah dropped a noodle onto his shirt, Sophie giggled and reached over with a napkin to clean it for him, while Jonathan looked across the table at Rebecca with eyes full of gratitude. She hadn't just brought color into his home. She had awakened a way of living he had long forgotten. Rebecca whispered, "Maybe we should make this meal every week." Jonathan nodded, and for the first time, instead of thinking about long-term plans for the company, he thought about setting up a tent in the backyard over the weekend, or teaching the kids how to grow tomatoes next summer. That night, when Rebecca tucked Sophie into bed, the little girl tugged gently on her mother's hand and whispered, "Mummy, this house has laughter now." Rebecca pulled her close, hugging her tightly as tears gathered quietly at the corners of her eyes. "Yes, sweetheart, and I believe that laughter is never going to leave us again." Downstairs, Jonathan was putting away the last of the dishes, and his eyes lingered on a new photo taken earlier that day. The four of them, arms wrapped around one another beneath the tree, beaming with joy. This house was no longer a lonely fortress. It was becoming something else entirely. A home, a place where laughter would echo, day after day, like a song that never fades. That late afternoon, as the sun gently descended over Lake Michigan, the little family sat together on the grass behind the villa, a space that had once been nothing more than a cold, empty yard, now transformed into a quiet haven of peace. The sunset stretched across the sky like a soft ribbon of pink and amber silk, casting a golden glow over Sophie and Noah's hair as they laughed, releasing tiny paper boats into the water's edge. Rebecca sat beside Jonathan, her hand gently laced in his, saying nothing but understanding everything. In that silence, they both knew this moment was the greatest reward after so many days filled with loneliness and weariness. It wasn't money or title that mattered, but the honest presence of one another. A home defined not by bloodlines but by love, and the choice to stay, day after day. Jonathan watched the children, and his gaze was no longer that of a wealthy CEO, but of a father learning to love by simply being there. Rebecca leaned her head against his shoulder and whispered that she had never believed love could begin again in such a gentle and beautiful way, and that, truly, is the miracle of life. You may fall, you may break, but you can still move forward, still learn to love again, and build a family from pieces that once seemed too broken to fit. The story of Jonathan, Rebecca, Noah, and Sophie is not just one of romance or family. It is the journey of fractured hearts, finding their way back through tenderness, shared moments, and the courage to open up. Through it, we are reminded that sometimes the most precious things in life aren't what we can buy, but what we can feel when we show up fully, love deeply, and live honestly beside those who matter most. Family doesn't always begin with blood. Sometimes it begins with an understanding glance, a hand reaching out at just the right time, or an unexpected embrace on the day we feel our weakest. And what about you? What does this story make you think of? Have you ever met someone who completely changed the way you see life? Do you believe that love can begin again from something as small and unassuming as a quiet moment or a shared smile? We would love to hear from you. Please share your thoughts and stories in the comments below. Every heartfelt emotion you leave behind is a gift that helps us continue spreading stories of humanity and healing. Don't forget to subscribe to Emotional Echoes, and if this story touched you, please like and share the video. Join us each day as we bring you more stories that stir the heart and speak to the everyday soul. We believe that each of us deserves to be loved, to heal, and to be reminded of the beauty in simply being. Thank you for staying with us until this final moment. Wishing you good health, joyful days, and deep peace in every step. Farewell, and see you again in the next story from Emotional Echoes.